environment to help consolidate their memory. Could be that they don't elaborate as much. Could be that they don't pay attention as much to all those other things. Could just be that they don't have enough cognitive resources to do the integration on their own. Why may this be relevant to age differences with memory? Actually, at least one study shows that if you give them the contextual cues and if you try to help them integrate it, for example, you actually give them a picture. If you want them to memorize a whole bunch of pictures, you give them a pictorial cue. You already give them a pictorial cue that is in the exact same perceptual category or semantic category as your target. Then they tend to do better. If you give them, irrelevant pictures or cues, they tend to do worse, or they just don't benefit from the cues. So if you help them to do some of the organization, you help them do some of the work, essentially, then they're fine. So once again, it brings to mind, resources. If you have fewer resources, what are you going to do? Help them out. Now the next one, inhibition failure. It's very similar to the concept that many of you have brought up already. And by that we mean attention, inhibition versus attention. A lot of things going on in the room. Some people seem to be really fixated on certain aspects of the environment that are not crucial and important to them. And because of that, they do not hear a single word. One problem some children may have, for example, like if they have attentional deficit hyperactivity disorder, they may find it much harder to stay focused on one thing. And it could also be that they can't inhibit their tendency to fixate or pay attention to other things in the environment. So I think overall, the take-home message is that for a lot of older adults, it may be harder for them to filter out those unnecessary information because inhibition, unlike habituation, or I should say compared to other things like habituation, inhibition requires some level of cognitive processing and resources. It is not completely passive. Something is going on. You do have to select. It may not be completely conscious to you. You may not be aware of it. This is not to say that you don't need to make an effort to try to filter things out. For example, you're really hungry right now, and you really want to think about food or where to have dinner tonight, but you also really, really want to make sure you are paying attention to, you learn these things on the slide. So you have to, that would involve some active inhibition, actually. You have to control yourself and say, okay, don't think about food yet. And by the way, the more you try not to think about something, the more you're going to be thinking about that, unfortunately. The first 4 points make sense so far? Okay. And you can tell that they're all interrelated, and they're all based on a very similar concept or construct, even though we don't know where the cognitive resources really is, where they are located. Yes.
For inhibition, is it difficulty in focusing when they want to focus, or is it lack of interest in what they're doing?
That's a good point. What do you think? What does the rest of the class think? Is it just because they don't have the ability, or they're not interested?
Which one? Speaking of being unfocused, which question?
Inhibition.
I think it's probably both.
Yeah, I would think so too. So in general, yes, it's harder for them to inhibit additional sources of information because if we're focusing only on the resource theories, then the assumption is that they have fewer resources to take care of the filtering and the inhibition, and that's why. But you're absolutely right. It could be that they're not motivated. And motivation has something to do with attention as well, and it has something to do with inhibition. And so if you're motivated to think of something else, it means your cognitive resources are now moved, transferred to a different task. And so, in a way, it still explains itself somewhat. Does that make sense?
What about like internal versus external? Like I'm just kind of daydreaming or whatever, but I don't know, how does that work?
I'm not
Like-
sure if I got your question.
With memory, like if you're thinking about something, but it has like nothing to do with your surroundings, but it's like distracting you.
Mhm. That could be a problem as well if you cannot inhibit all those other things, thoughts that you have in mind.
But is like inhibiting something external different than inhibiting work? Sorry,
I
Sorry,
don't,
Claire.
no, that's a good point. I don't want to give you a very concrete answer right now. I'm not sure if I have enough information at this point to answer that question. I do know that if we're talking about internal processes and, other types of things that may cause an impairment to your ability to inhibit information, though. For example, if you're really anxious, and you start having all those worries in your head, that would also take up some of your cognitive resources. So in a way, I guess both internal and external types of distractions could be a problem. And if you are more focused, if you're more motivated to focus, if for some reason you are just better at focusing and inhibiting additional information in general, then most likely you will be better at encoding and retrieving information. Is that clear? Still a little unclear? Or shall we move on? Okay. Now, which one is next? Okay, working memory. We have talked extensively about this one, so perhaps somebody can actually help me out. Why do you think working memory capacity, a lower working memory capacity, why would that affect a person's memory performance in general? We actually just talked about those things. Yeah?
Might be less able to manipulate what's happening currently, and then be able to filter that down into long-term memory.
Right. Very good. Anything else to add to that point? No? So I don't really want to repeat myself, but yeah, basically working memory, once again, it's about control processes, how you try to pick what is relevant, what is not, manipulate things that are useful for you versus not useful for you. And if your working memory capacity is slower, if it's smaller, that would mean you have a smaller working space. Just imagine if you have a computer with a smaller working memory is to the RAM, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, if your RAM is small, then you're not going to be as efficient when it comes to processing information. So that is the idea why as we age, we tend to be doing less well overall. And our working memory capacity is also lower. Now, finally, perceptual speed. A lot have been said and done about sensory perceptual speed and changes and so on. And we all know that as we age, there will be some sort of slowing going on. For some people, it doesn't really show up until much, much, much later. But even in the sense of, sensory perceptual decline, like visual acuity or your hearing, a lot of times problems begin to show up. Like in the introduction of the Stein paper as well, I think they mentioned maybe it's just genetic. That's the way how we're pre-programmed, unfortunately. And so